There's a war happening in your life right now, and you have not noticed it because it was never designed to be noticed. It does not announce itself. It does not feel like a battle. It feels like a Tuesday. It feels like being tired for no reason. It feels like a friendship that quietly went cold. It feels like a thought that showed up uninvited and you assumed it was yours. That is not an accident. That is the strategy. Most people picture spiritual warfare as something loud, a crisis, a collapse, a moment evil enough to finally fight back against. That picture is exactly why the real war goes undetected. This is not that war. This is quieter, slower, and far more effective because it was engineered to look like nothing at all, a fragmented attention span, a standard that moved an inch at a time, a gratitude that thinned out without a single dramatic loss, a body too depleted to notice any of it happening. 4 fronts, none of them loud, all of them active in your life right now. Once you know how to see it, you cannot unsee it. And that is exactly what the enemy is counting on, you never doing. Before we go any further, there's one thing you need to understand, because it changes how you read everything that follows. This war is not random. Ephesians 6:12 says our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against rulers, against authorities, against the powers of this dark world. Notice the wording. Struggle, not accident, not bad luck. A struggle implies an opponent who is actively working patiently in the places you have stopped paying attention to. Here is the part that should unsettle you. Silence is not the absence of a battle. Silence is what it looks like when the battle has already moved past the front lines you're guarding into the ones you forgot existed. There are 4 of those fronts. Here they are in the order they are most commonly opened. The first front is your attention. Before anything is stolen from you, your attention is stolen first, not through anything dramatic, through fragmentation, a notification, a scroll, a distraction dressed as rest. 1 Peter 5:38 tells us to be sober-minded, watchful, because our adversary is looking for someone to devour. Watchful is the operative word. A person who is not watching cannot notice when something shifts. The enemy does not need to convince you of a lie outright. He only needs to keep your attention scattered enough that you never sit still long enough to examine what you actually believe. Think about how this looks in an ordinary week. Hours pass, and you could not tell someone what you thought about, what you prayed about, what you let into your mind. Not because you are lazy, because your attention was never yours that day. It was rented out piece by piece to whatever moved fastest. Here's the diagnostic. When was the last time you sat in silence, without a screen, without noise, long enough to hear your own thoughts clearly enough to test them? If you cannot remember, that is not a scheduling problem. That is a front line, and it has been undefended for a while. The second front is your standard. It moves slower than temptation, and it does not attack with an obvious wrong. It attacks with normalization, asking you to slowly redefine what wrong means, one small allowance at a time, until the line has moved so far you no longer remember where it used to be. Romans 12:2 warns against being conformed to the pattern of this world. Conformed is a slow verb. Nobody wakes up conformed. It happens the way water shapes stone. Not through force, through repetition, through time, through exposure so constant it stops registering as exposure at all. Dangerous compromises rarely feel dangerous while they are happening. They feel reasonable. They feel like everyone else does this. They feel like it's not that serious, and it isn't, not the first time. It becomes serious the 40th time, when the standard has moved so far that the person you were 5 years ago would not recognize the one you have become. No single step along the way was ever big enough to notice. Ask yourself this: is there a standard you held 5 years ago that you have quietly abandoned, not because you were convinced it was wrong, but because you simply stopped applying it? That is not growth. That is drift. And drift is a silent war tactic with a long track record. The third front is your gratitude. Gratitude is the subtlest front of all, subtle enough that most believers never identify it as spiritual warfare. It looks like discontent. It looks like comparison. It looks like the quiet, constant sense that your life is missing something, that other people have what you were supposed to have, that God is somehow behind schedule on you. That tactic worked first in the garden on Eve. The enemy did not tell her God was evil. He asked whether God had really said, and then pointed her toward the one tree she did not have. In a garden full of trees she did. He was never trying to convince her God was withholding everything. He only needed her staring at the one thing instead of the abundance surrounding her. Genesis 3 records what happened next. She saw that the fruit was good and desirable, only after the comparison had already been planted. Discontent works the same way now. It rarely arrives as a full accusation against God. It arrives as a glance sideways at someone else's marriage, someone else's platform, someone else's answered prayer, and a quiet erosion of thankfulness for what is actually in front of you. Here's the test. When you scroll, when you compare, does what follows draw you closer to gratitude for your own life or further from it? If it is further, something is working on you and it is not neutral. The fourth front is your rest. Rest closes the loop on the other three fronts because a depleted person cannot defend anything. Exodus records that when the Israelites were in bondage, Pharaoh's strategy was not just labor. It was labor without straw, an impossible workload with no margin, engineered specifically so the people would have no capacity left to imagine freedom. A tired mind does not ask whether something is true. It just wants the discomfort to stop. That makes it the easiest mind to manage. One more question. Are you currently too depleted to notice any of the first three fronts, even after hearing them named? That answer alone tells you where the next move needs to be made. Now, a necessary caution. Not every bad week is a spiritual attack. Not every distraction is demonic. Some exhaustion is simply the cost of a hard season, and some drift is simply the slow work of a life that needs better habits, not an exorcism. Naming these fronts is not meant to hand you a conspiracy behind every closed door. It is meant to make you the kind of person who notices when the ordinary stops being ordinary. Because that is the only kind of person a silent war cannot work on indefinitely. Here is what the enemy is counting on, that you will hear all of this, agree with it in the moment, and then close the video and let the noise refill the silence before you've acted on anything you just recognized. Awareness that does not lead anywhere is not victory. It is just a longer, more informed version of the same drift. But here's what he is not counting on. Jesus told Peter on the exact night the tactics were about to be deployed against him in full that he had already been prayed for before the attack ever landed. The intercession came first. It always does. Hebrews 7:25 says he always lives to intercede for those who come to him. Not sometimes, not when it's convenient, always. So the war is real, the fronts are real, and you were never meant to guard them alone. Before the last word, do one thing for me. Of the four fronts, your attention, your standard, your gratitude, your rest, which one just described you? Say it in the comments. Not a paragraph, one word. Because somebody scrolling past will read your one word and realize they weren't the only one. And that alone breaks the silence this whole thing depends on. And if this is the kind of teaching you want more of, subscribe to the Bible Path. We go where the warnings actually are, not where they're comfortable. Hit the bell too. The enemy works in the gaps between the times you remember to check. Notice it, name it, and don't hand your attention, your standard, your gratitude, or your rest back to something that has been counting on your silence the whole time.